It made it to the billion-dollar club, but it turned out to be the MCU's most divisive film to date. As we march towards Civil War, Johnnie Torch takes on Iron Man 3. Tony Stark finds we create our own demons as Aldrich Killian, whom Tony shunned years before, returns to challenge him and take all that he holds dear. Now Tony must use all his skills without his armor to rely on to foil a plot against the president led by the sinister Mandarin. Should we get the elephant in the room out of the way now? The Mandarin. There isn't a Mandarin in this film. Not really. I might actually be okay with that if they didn't try to pass Killian off as the Mandarin. Or is he supposed to be Fing Fang Foom because of the dragon tattoos? I don't know. If anything, he's more like the Melter from the comics given his power set. But I digress. Anyway, I get that a lot of people complain that Iron Man was always facing Iron Man ripoffs. Ironmonger and Whiplash were just men in armor suits. I get that they wanted to mix things up this time. But in the end, he's basically a shirtless guy with an expensive haircut. Not the strongest of visuals. I also agree with the contention some have that Killian's powers are not really unique given that all his minions have them also. Getting back to Ben Kingsley's Mandarin, I can't really say that I was outraged. Kingsley was hilarious. I do suppose that I'm somewhat disappointed that for all the build-up, having an Oscar-worthy actor delivering epic-sounding lines, it turns Iron Man's arch-enemy into a spoof of the character. The Mandarin has been traditionally Iron Man's greatest nemesis. What Joker is to Batman, what Luthor is to Superman, you know. So a lot of people naturally have the mindset of, what if? You know, what if they actually played it straight and had Kingsley, who's a phenomenal actor? Let him make the Mandarin as imposing as we all thought he could be. How cool would that be? Now let me stop you right now. Before you say the typical line this film's defenders always throw out whenever someone objects to the Mandarin's treatment in this film, "Ooh, the Mandarin actually has fans. Who knew this before now?" Get over yourself. Every character deserves a respectable amount of fidelity to the source material, particularly when that character has such a long history in the comics for being one of the top heavy hitters. A Killian Mandarin cannot be any farther removed from the source material. There was an animated series a few years ago called Iron Man Armored Adventures, and it had Tony, Pepper, and Rhodey as teenagers. But even that had a better served version of the Mandarin than in Iron Man 3. Honestly, when you think of the Mandarin, what comes to mind? A Chinese man dressed regally wearing 10 rings of power. How does any of that translate to Killian? Of course, they really should have made the Mandarin Chinese, but can't do that. We might offend somebody. Actually, the real reason is greed. They can't make millions on the film in China if the Chinese object to the lead villain being Chinese. So he's got to be race changed. And to be honest, even that could have worked. The original Iron Man story was written at the time of the Vietnam War, so obviously, you really need to bring the concept up to date for modern times. The enemy of today is from Middle Eastern radicals, and that was set up all very well in the first film with the 10 Rings as the terrorist group. But its storyline is never made good on here, as Killian has somehow co-opted the 10 Rings for his own use as a metaphorical boogeyman. Well, we need to move on. I didn't want to turn this whole review into a full-out Mandarin rant, but at least Marvel extended an olive branch to Mandarin fans, so to speak, with the short film All Hail the King, in which the actual, really real, honest-to-goodness Mandarin seeks revenge on Trevor for sullying his good name. We don't actually see the Mandarin, but we are at least promised his existence. If Marvel will ever use the actual Mandarin, let's just say I won't be holding my breath. But it's good to know the option is still there. One of the most ridiculous aspects of this film is Pepper being the one actually defeating the villain. A lot of people just shrug this one off, but when you think of it, Tony was never able to defeat any of his main villains without an assist in his own movies. I think that he's the only hero to have that happen to him. The sad thing is, Killian actually had a very impressive death scene the first time they killed him in the Mark 42 armor. People are going to be tired of hearing me say it, but it just reeks of feminism. We can't let Pepper get captured and become a damsel in distress unless she somehow delivers the coup de grace to the villain. To put this into context, imagine, if you will, The season finale of Arrow Season 2. After Slade captures Felicity and kicks Ollie's butt from pillar to post, Felicity gets injected with the Merikuru and proceeds to defeat Slade in Ollie's stead. There would be outrage in the fan community such as the world has never known, and rightfully so. But that is exactly what's happening here. We have a character that heretofore never exhibited the slightest capability for any type of combat, and now suddenly she's an action hero and she simply defeats the villain after the story's actual protagonist fails. Dumb, dumb, dumb. But here I think is the worst offender. Tony having the arc reactor removed. It's indefensible, really. In the first film, it's the one thing that's keeping him alive. Why didn't he have the shrapnel removed in the first film if it were an option to him? Apparently, the arc reactor doesn't need to be in his chest to power his suits, as evidenced by the, at this point, 2 subsequent films starring Iron Man post-Iron Man 3. Worse yet, in Iron Man 2, the whole film revolved around him finding a cure for palladium poisoning. The whole film. If you're going to make that the basis for an entire film, you don't just go and have him simply remove the shrapnel in a throwaway scene at the end of the next blinking film. He could have saved his life with a simple operation in Iron Man 2. Not to mention in Avengers, he seemed to make peace with his condition in that scene with Bruce Banner. That was my favorite scene in the movie. It's a terrible privilege. And now what? He could have had it removed at any time? It doesn't make a lick of sense. And you can't just say, oh, we can ignore Iron Man 2. It wasn't very good anyway. It doesn't work like that. You have to play by the rules you've already established in your narrative. Iron Man 2 has its own flaws, but none nearly as glaring as the ones in this film. The film seems to go out of its way to provide closure, a la The Dark Knight Rises. Apparently there was a genuine concern over at Marvel that Robert Downey Jr. would hold them up at gunpoint during contract renegotiations, which is what leads the film to end as if it were the final time we'll ever see Iron Man, while leaving the door ever slightly ajar. This of course turned out to be quite unnecessary. What with Robert Downey Jr. signing up not only for Avengers Age of Ultron, but Civil War, Infinity War Parts 1 and 2, and a role of undisclosed length in Spider-Man Homecoming. Hindsight being 20/20 as it often is, Tony blowing all his suits seems very unnecessary, particularly in light of his equally prolific work in creating new suits and drones in between this film and Age of Ultron. One of the things I'm also not crazy about is the lack of Tony actually being in the armor. Now this is a theme common to all superhero franchises where they take one film to emphasize the clothes don't necessarily make the man. Tony is Iron Man with or without the suit. It's done about as well as can be expected. But it did seem like a huge cop-out to have one of the film's biggest set pieces, the airplane rescue, occur without Tony actually being in the armor. Now it probably sounds like I really hate this film, but to the contrary, it's really quite enjoyable despite the flaws. RDJ is top of his game as always. His scenes with the kid, Harley, were pretty funny. He and RDJ had a great rapport. And there was some real great action scenes outside his armor, such as the bar scene and the final confrontation with Killian. Getting to see the plethora of armors that Tony created in action based on the many different designs from the comics was a real treat. I also like the fact that they addressed his near-death in Avengers with his anxiety attacks. Suffering from them myself, I could sympathize. And they were depicted very accurately here by Robert Downey Jr. Pepper was better here than in Iron Man 2. She and Tony were kinda at odds for most of that film. Here, their relationship gets the right amount of focus. Rhodey was real good in this film, and I think I enjoyed Don Cheadle's performance here even more than Iron Man 2. As I understand it, the buddy film is one of director Shane Black's strengths, and it shows here. I was glad to see Happy Hogan get some screen time. I really enjoy Jon Favreau as the character, and I'm so glad he not only appeared, but he actually got some very cool and humorous things to do. Guy Pearce does a great job playing Aldrich Killian with a suitable snake-like charm. I like the Ensign flashback also. I was a bit disappointed in no AC/DC in the soundtrack. I don't mind not using it in every Iron Man appearance, but here, in his own, potentially last solo film, it would have made the trilogy feel like it came full circle. So in conclusion, I'd say this film is highly flawed, probably more so than any of Marvel's films up to this point, but it's hardly a disaster by any means. If this is one of Marvel's weaker outings, I'd say they're in pretty good shape overall. I'm giving Iron Man 3 4 stars out of 5. This is Johnnie Torch reminding you yet again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.